Hi, I'm Derek Downey, and welcome to Tarot and Human Development, where I'm exploring self-development and the Western mystery tradition. In this video, I'll be reading my latest article, Cancer in Tarot Cards, How to Love Wisely. About halfway through this video, I'll be getting into my own personal interpretations of the 5 tarot cards associated with Cancer, so if you'd rather skip to that, I'll have the timestamps to those in the description of this video. Also, everything I mentioned in this video, every source, every video, every book, I'll have a link to that in the description as well. And last, if you're interested in getting access to my free one-page guide to all 78 tarot cards, if you sign up to my email list, then I will send that to you. That is in the description as well. Without further ado, Cancer in Tarot Cards, How to Love Wisely. According to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the following tarot cards represent Cancer. The Chariot, Major Arcana number 7. The Queen of Cups. The Two of Cups, which is Venus and Cancer. The Three of Cups, which is Mercury and Cancer. And the Four of Cups, which is the Moon and Cancer. In this video, I'm going to give some traditional ideas about Cancer, then 3 ideas I personally associate with Cancer, and last I will give my interpretations of each tarot card. So let's start with traditional ideas about Cancer. In her book, The Only Astrology Book You'll Ever Need, Joanna Martine Woolfolk describes Cancer as, quote, receptive, sensitive, and imaginative, sympathetic, kind, and emotional, and possesses an active, shrewd, intuitive mind, end quote. In his 5th lecture on astrotheology, Manly P. Hall describes Cancer as representing the vice of emotional moodiness and the virtue of the mastery of moods, which I believe is another way of saying emotional resilience. Cancer is ruled by the moon, and the moon symbolizes change because its light is in a constant state of change from one phase to the next. It also represents reflection because it reflects the light of the sun. Similarly, our emotions tend to be in a constant state of change from one mood to the next. Hall says that when we succumb to our moods, we become, quote, a servant of the tides, like a ship in a storm, end quote. The virtue of Cancer is reclaiming our authority over our emotions. Now, this isn't to say we should become a tyrant who rules with an iron fist and squashes our emotions anytime we begin to feel something undesirable. If we do that, our emotional self will remember those grievances and retaliate against us with a vengeance as soon as it gets the chance. See the Tower tarot card for a depiction of what that looks like. Instead, we must see our higher self as the captain and our emotional self as a resourceful crew member who must be treated with dignity and respect. Hall ends by saying that the light of the moon is temperamental. Sometimes it's a bright full moon, and sometimes it's a dark new moon. Thus, instead of relying on the light of the moon to guide us on our journey, he says, quote, we must gain the ability to keep our light, even when the moon becomes dark, end quote. Like Carl Jung said, when you discover what supports you after you can no longer support yourself, you will have found an indestructible foundation. Teaching from an esoteric astrology standpoint, William Meeder said in his blog and lecture at the Theosophical Society that Cancer is associated with the principle of foundations. Because of this, Cancer is often associated with the mother and the home, both of which are foundational to life. Meeder also said that Cancer facilitates the transformation of our biological instincts, which is another foundation, into divine intuition. He said he believes Cancer is one of the most Christ-filled signs of the zodiac, along with Pisces, with the Christ principle manifesting itself through the creation of a foundation of nurturing, wise, supportive love for ourselves and for others. While other signs might be more goal-oriented, Cancer is a diffused sign, and its big message is that home is not the four walls you live in. Your home is your entire life, including your career, your friendships, your relationships, your interests, and so on. Once we see every facet of our life as a different room in our home, Cancer then encourages us to ask, quote, how well lit are those rooms? Are any of those light bulbs getting a bit dim? End quote. When we go from having a foundation that is temperamental and conditional to one that is all-pervasive and spiritual, we transition Cancer from its lower ruler of the moon to its higher ruler of Neptune. Now that I've touched on some traditional ideas, let's move on to the ideas I personally associate with Cancer. Concept number 1. Emotions always reflect needs. Cancer is one of the 3 water signs in the zodiac. Water symbolizes reflection because light reflects off water, and it symbolizes reception because you can dive into a pool of water. Contemplation on these 2 words provides me with all sorts of concepts also associated with water. For example, listening is receiving the light of others, and empathy is reflecting the light of others back to them. When people consistently empathize with each other over a period of time, they develop relationships. And you'll often see the suit of cups, which is the suit of water, associated with relationships. So I think this idea of reflection is kind of a deeper core of why it is associated with relationships. Love, forgiveness, and trust are about receiving someone as they are and accepting them without judgment or requiring them to change. Intuition, divination, and scrying are about receiving information from a spiritual intelligence beyond our thinking self. Notice how all of the concepts above have a kind of acceptance or going with the flow quality to them. To me, this is the definitive feature of water. While fire is about the heat and energy that gets us moving, water is about allowing ourselves to be moved. As Carl Jung said, I don't make myself, I happen to myself. This is why others describe water as being passive and fire as active. However, I personally don't like the word passive because I could see it being used to describe someone who is apathetic and disconnected from others. Instead, I like to use the word receptive because I think that better highlights the fact that listening and love are still very much active activities. Another traditional association with water is the emotions, while fire is associated with desires. When I first started my journey into occult philosophy, I had a very difficult time understanding this distinction. To me, emotions and desires were the same thing. Desiring was just one expression of our emotional nature. More recently, I've internalized the distinction between these two, all thanks to the ideas within nonviolent communication and human givens theory. Fire is all about our needs. We have physical needs, such as the need to stay warm, drink water, breathe air, and eat food. Fire, water, air, earth. We also have emotional needs, such as the need to feel safe, to feel in control, and to feel we have purpose. And then I have some links here to some lists of our innate emotional needs. These needs are the fire in the furnace of our steam engine that help drive us toward goals. I believe these needs could also be considered impulses since they impel our behavior. And as John Dewey wrote, quote, obstruction of the immediate execution of an impulse converts it into a desire, end quote. Water is all about our feelings. And just as a body of water reflects the light of a fire, our feelings are a direct reflection of, but still different from, our needs. For example, we have a need to drink water, but we have the feeling of being thirsty. We have a need to socialize with others, but we have the feeling of being lonely. We have a need to be in control of our lives, but we have the feeling of being powerless. So they're very closely related, but still totally different. These feelings are not dictated by our logical thinking self, but by our unconscious emotional self. This emotional self is a resource that Mother Nature has evolved in us in order to help us decide how we ought to act in the moment. Except there's one problem. Because it is focused on being in the moment, our emotional self often lacks foresight and is sometimes unable to recognize the complexity or nuance of a situation, which Joe Griffin calls kaitextia, or context blindness. Examples of the lack of foresight of the emotional self include road rage and depression, two states of extreme emotional arousal that cause someone to forget that there even is a future or consequences. Another example of kaitextia, or context blindness, of our emotions is a military veteran whose PTSD is triggered by the sound of fireworks, or a person so in love with a partner that they are blind to their abuses, like in Stockholm Syndrome. Thus, one lesson of cancer can be to recognize that just as a home is a physical shelter designed to protect us from the dangers of the environment, our emotional self is a biological shelter designed to protect us from malnourishment of our emotional needs. As I mentioned in my article on Aries, I like to think of my emotional unconscious self as a kind of huge grizzly bear that follows me around, which I call Mama Bear. The moment she detects danger, she will roar at the threat, ready to kill. However, she is not me. She is my mom trying to protect me. Likewise, we are not our emotions. We are the center of awareness who experiences the emotions. Once we internalize this difference, we begin to unlock a new power within ourselves, which leads us to concept number 2, honor emotions, but choose actions. One paradox of the human being is that we are both a single self and multiple selves at the same time. These multiple selves include a body, which is the physical material self, a mind, which is the intellectual thinking self, a soul, which is the emotional instinctual self, and a spirit, which is the observing conscious self. All 4 of these selves are like puppeteers fighting for control of the same puppet, you. If you do not make a conscious distinction between all of these puppeteers, then you will not be able to recognize who is controlling the puppet at any given moment. This can lead to traumatic experiences where our emotional self causes us to act in irrational and disturbing ways, and our intellectual self is then forced to grapple with the question, how could I have done something like that? According to acceptance and commitment therapy, we ought to give control of the puppet over to our observing self, which is the self that witnesses everything, but is still separate from everything. This means that it is free to observe our thoughts, our emotions, our body, and our environment. And it is free to listen to their guidance and advice, but it is still able to make its own decisions. I believe this observing self idea in psychology is somewhat similar to the holy guardian angel in the Western mystery traditions, in that both entities represent a higher aspect of ourself that can act as a leader of the council, as the sun center that all other planetary bodies revolve around. When we internalize the reality of these different selves, we arrive at two important conclusions. The first conclusion is something that Dr. Paul Jenkins says all the time, which is, quote, "You are always right about how you feel," end quote. Your emotions are always true, always valid, and never wrong, because they are your unconscious emotional self's authentic reaction to what you are experiencing, whether it's in your external world or internal imagination. Allowing our intellectual thinking self to shame and judge our emotional instinctual self for having the wrong emotion is unhealthy and counterproductive. Instead, we must accept that our emotional self is a kind of autonomous being with its own values and goals. However, just because our emotional self is its own autonomous entity does not mean that it is uncontrollable. This leads me to the second conclusion, which is you can always control your actions, and your actions influence your emotions. Now, don't misinterpret me here. I'm not saying that we should suppress or repress our emotions. As Mark Terrell put it in his video here, quote, "If we never take account of our own feelings, we can lead unfulfilled lives leadened with suppressed, unpursued dreams," end quote. Instead, I'm saying that by recognizing that there is a higher self, or observing self, above our emotions and thoughts, we give ourselves the opportunity to let that self control our behavior, despite our emotions. That self can choose to do things that influences our emotions, such as removing ourselves from a situation or envisioning ourselves sitting on a beach waiting for the emotion to pass. Since our emotions are reflective in nature, they will inevitably react to our next actions. Mark Terrell goes one step further in the same video linked above and says, quote, "Evidence shows that believing you can change a negative mood makes you much more able to start doing so," end quote. The two conclusions above are echoed by multiple therapy professionals. Here's how they put it. Quote, "It's okay to feel scared, anxious, or nervous, but we can choose our actions," end quote. And that is Emma McAdam in her Therapy in a Nutshell video here. Next quote, "It's okay to have emotions. It's not okay to be emotional," end quote. And that is a rule by Matthew Carroll, who is a conflict mediator. So he's saying when he's helping people resolve conflicts, it's okay for both parties to have emotions, but they can't get emotional. They can't start screaming at each other and they can't start sobbing uncontrollably. That doesn't help resolve the conflict. So when resolving conflict, it's okay to have the emotions, but it's not okay to act emotional. Quote, "To be true to ourselves, we need to think of our feelings as advisors, not as deranged, bellowing autocrats dictating our every move. An emotional response may or may not be valid. We must help clients realize that they can captain their own ship," end quote. And this is Mark Terrell in his Uncommon Practitioners video here. And I'll just mention that he says an emotional response may or may not be valid. I interpret that as saying the emotion is valid, but the action you participate in next because of the emotion may or may not be valid. In pop culture, the sign of Cancer is associated with homebodies who are fiercely loyal and protective of their closest friends and family members. Kind of like some species of crabs who are highly protective of their burrows and mates. I believe this is a perfect description of our emotional self. Our emotions are like a friend who is fiercely loyal and protective of us, who will fight anyone who disrespects us, and who would prefer we stay safe at home instead of adventure into the unknown where there might be monsters. However, we must remember that they are our friend, not our boss. We must listen and empathize with them, because what type of a friend would we be if we didn't? But at the end of the day, our higher self is in control of our actions. Remaining in control of our behavior despite our feelings, which in turn helps us control our feelings, is the definition of emotional resilience, which leads me to concept number 3. Concept number 3. True love grows resilience, not comfort. Within this past year, I started therapy for the first time in my life. During my first session, I mentioned in passing a childhood memory of playing Mortal Kombat with a friend and intentionally losing because he would lose his temper when I won. I mentioned this as an example of my kind nature and was caught entirely off guard when my therapist responded, "And do you think that is what was best for him?" I used to think that love was about making others feel good and protecting them from feeling bad. However, as Reverend Ann Davies of the Builders of the Adytum pointed out in one of her lectures, quote, "You have to have wisdom to know how to handle love properly. Otherwise, you can destroy, even with your love, like when you spoil people, keeping them from growing. Wisdom is a part of love, because you don't love fully until you love wisely." End quote. For those of you studying Kabbalah, this is a pretty straightforward explanation of why Chokmah, or wisdom, is above Chesed, or mercy or love. I now think that true love is something that provides an indestructible emotional foundation upon which others can grow into more authentic and resilient versions of themselves, rather than making sure they feel good all of the time. Bad feelings are not something to be avoided at all costs. In fact, we shouldn't even label them as bad. Let's just call them uncomfortable or unpleasurable. Both pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings are like flight instruments in the cockpit of our aircraft, helping us understand where we are now and where we should go next. A loving friend is like the co-pilot sitting next to us through it all. In video 2 of her series on how to help a child with anxiety, Emma McAdam describes how the goal of a greenhouse is not to protect plants and keep them safe, but to create a space where plants can grow up to be functional, healthy, and productive outdoors. She then says, quote, "Now, one thing most people don't know about greenhouses is that they don't simply keep the plant comfortable. A good greenhouse actually has all sorts of features that gradually introduce the seedlings to challenge. These are things like fans, temperature changes, pot changes, and gradually introducing the plants to more and more difficult conditions. Now, your job as a parent is not to protect your child from anxiety, but to help them learn to be resilient so they can be functional and healthy humans." End quote. If we shelter someone from all challenge all of the time, they will become fragile and dependent upon us to protect them every time they feel uncomfortable. However, if we support someone as they overcome their own challenge, we give them the opportunity to grow resilient, confident, and independent. Manly Hall described the zodiac sign of Cancer as symbolic of the womb. Can you think of anything more loving than a womb? It might be the pinnacle example of a loving, nourishing, safe, and selfless environment. However, even the most loving womb does not keep a child safe forever. Its ultimate purpose is to grow the child to the point that Once it separates from the womb and enters the outside world, the child is not only able to survive, but thrive. While within the womb, the child needs to grow an emotional exoskeleton that is hard enough to protect themselves, but also not so hard that they can't move. So how can we help the ones we love develop their emotional resilience? Below is a physical tip, an intellectual tip, and an emotional tip. Note that although all of these are intended toward parents, I believe they are relevant to anyone who loves anyone. Physical tip: be a role model of resilience. Emma McAdams' first principle in her video here is that it is more effective for a parent to change their approach to anxiety than to teach the kids new skills or only send them to therapy. Instead of trying to change your loved ones, change yourself. How do you handle your anger, sadness, frustration, or other uncomfortable feelings? Become a role model for others to look to. Intellectual tip: use the word "and" when validating emotions. This is another tip by Emma McAdam in her video here. She says, quote, "When we validate emotions, we can also use the word "and." We can feel nervous and breathe. You can cry at drop-off and go to school." End quote. By changing our language, we are helping others realize that they can honor their emotions but still choose their actions. Emotional tip: be their most powerful, biggest fan. In his video here, Dr. Paul Jenkins said that kids need to know that they have someone in their life who is more powerful than they are and who loves them unconditionally. As a thought experiment, think of someone you really admire, like a famous athlete or artist or entrepreneur. Now, how would you feel if they reached out to you saying how much they love your work and that they want to support you any way they can? You would feel pretty damn good, right? When powerful people love us, we feel more powerful ourselves. Thus, the best thing we can do for other people is to become the best, most powerful version of ourselves, and then love and accept them no matter what and even if. That's what Dr. Jenkins says is the role of a parent, is to love their child, quote, no matter what and even if, end quote. This brings me to the tarot card interpretations. The Chariot, Major Arcana number 7. In the Hermetic Kabbalah, the Chariot sits on the path between the third Sephirah, Bina, and the fifth Sephirah, Geburah. According to Dion Fortune, Bina represents form, which she describes as a, quote, state of interacting stresses which have achieved stability, end quote. For example, an atom, like how we're composed of atoms, could be thought of as a form that maintains its structure through the interacting stresses of the positively charged nucleus and the negatively charged electrons. Because of its form-giving nature, Bina is described as the great mother of life. Yet at the same time, Bina is also attributed with the vision of sorrow. Fortune says about this, quote, "It must be remembered, however, that life confined in a form, although it is enabled thereby to organize and so evolve, is much less free than it was when it was unlimited, though also unorganized, on its own plane. Involvement in a form is therefore the beginning of the death of life. It is a straightening and a limiting, a binding and a constricting. Form checks life, thwarts it, and yet enables it to organize. Seen from the point of view of free-moving force, Incarceration in a form is extinction. Form disciplines force with a merciless severity. The disembodied spirit of force and Hokmah is immortal. There is nothing of it that can grow old or die. But the embodied spirit of form and Bina sees death on the horizon as soon as its day dawns. End quote. In other words, Bina represents the vision of sorrow, because every birth into form is also a death sentence, for all forms are inevitably devoured by Father Time. Meanwhile, Fortune says that Geburah, the fifth Sephirah, is ruled by Mars and represents, quote, the king in his chariot going forth to war, end quote. So Hesed is the king on the throne during peacetime, and Geburah is the king in the chariot going to war. Dion Fortune describes the process of metabolism, like the process that our digestive system does in order to create energy. She describes the process of metabolism as composed of two functions. The first function is anabolism. This is where an organism takes in energy, such as food or sunlight, and then converts it into a form where the energy remains dormant, such as fat cells or carbohydrates. This constructive process is associated with Hesed. On the other hand, Geburah is associated with the second function called catabolism. Catabolism is the process of destroying those forms, those fat cells or carbohydrates, in order to release the energy asleep inside of them so that that energy may be used by the organism in that moment. Thus, Fortune associates Geburah with the idea of sacrifice, saying the following, quote, Geburah is the sacrificial priest of the mysteries. Now, sacrifice does not mean giving up something that is dear to you, because a jealous God will brook no rival interests in his devotees and is flattered by your pain. It means the deliberate and open-eyed choice of a greater good and preference to a lesser good, as the athlete prefers the fatigue of exercise to the ease of the sloth that puts him out of condition. Coal burned in a furnace is sacrificed to the god of steam power. Sacrifice is really the transmutation of force. The latent energy in the coal offered up on the sacrificial altar of the furnace is transmuted into the dynamic energy of steam by means of the appropriate machinery. End quote. Thus, the chariot represents that powerful intersection between the form of yourself, or your individuality, and your ability to reform the world around you. Whereas some cards are more about letting go and going with the flow, this card is all about reclaiming your authority to intentionally cause change in the world. This is why Arthur Edward Waite said in his book, The Pictorial Key to the Tarot, that, quote, the chariot is concerned with the mystery of nature and not of the world of grace. The planes of his conquest are manifest or external and not within himself. He can change the world, but might be caught in the bondage of logical understanding. End quote. In other words, the chariot is about your authority to impose change on the material world. But do not forget that your logic, the logic that you use to guide your decision-making, is that of a reasoning ape or a thoughtful monkey. If you make your thinking self the driver of your chariot instead of your higher self, your logic will inevitably lead you to immoral and unsustainable situations where you treat everyone and everything around you as a tool to be used by you, instead of as recognizing them as your brothers and sisters, as units of the same one consciousness as you. Do not forget that your logic and your emotions are the two horses pulling your chariot. They are the horses, not the driver. Your higher observing self is the driver. I believe Cancer's receptive influence in this card reminds us that our external behaviors should flow out of us naturally, instead of being forced out of us intellectually. One final note about the Chariot card. Much spiritual insight can be attained if you contemplate the fact that a chariot is a vehicle that allows the driver to stand still while the world moves around them. In his book, The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order, Paul Foster Case describes this as follows. Quote, "The I am does nothing, for the I am is the one identity called God, and God is changeless. That one identity is the witness of activity, but is not itself modified or altered by the transformations that go on around it. All change, all modification is in the field of energy that revolves around the I am. The self does nothing. It never has done anything. It is simply the witness of the panorama of transformations proceeding from its own mysterious power." End quote. The Queen of Cups. The Queen of Cups represents watery water, which can be interpreted as pure reception and reflection. Joe Monteleone, the amazing teacher over at the Tarot Mysticism Academy, whose level 2 class inspired me to start this blog in the first place, thank you, Joe, associates the Queen cards with interpersonal, one-on-one interactions between you and one other person. This is compared to the King or Prince cards, which are more mass interactions between you and a group of people. Since the Queen of Cups is watery water, without any other element mixed in, I believe she represents all of the virtues and vices of water. As I've already mentioned, I personally believe that the central feature of water is its ability to receive and reflect light. Because of that, I also associate water with the following words or ideas: going with the flow, letting go, faith, surrender, acceptance, appreciation. These are all about receiving the outside world as it is today. All of these lead us to a state of vulnerability and absorption of the mystery. Listening, empathy, compassion, trust, love, forgiveness. These are about receiving and reflecting other people as they are today. Feelings, emotions, happiness, sadness, hunger, etc. These are all a direct reflection of our needs. When we need food, we feel hungry. The feeling is different than the need. And then I have links again to the Center for Nonviolent Communications list of needs and a separate list of feelings. Example lists of needs and feelings. There's not a definitive list. Meditation, contemplation, grace. These are all about a reception and reflection of the divine light of Source or God. Intuition, hunch, instinct, divination, premonition, sixth sense, second sight. These are all about receiving and reflecting information that is handed to you by someone or something beyond your thinking self. As you can see, the reception and reflection of the Queen of Cups can express itself in many ways. If you are the type of person who talks a lot, often giving advice that was not asked for, like me, this card represents just listening. The Queen of Cups is not about solving people's problems. She is about making them feel heard. She is about reflecting others back at themselves so that they may see themselves more clearly. If the other person does ask for advice, then she turns her ear inward and listens to her intuition, her hierophant, her inner teacher, and recites back what she hears that teacher say. Last, the Queen of Cups is not about striving. The Knight of Wands, who is fiery fire, is about that raw assertion of one's will in order to satisfy a need. It is important to be assertive in life, but it is equally important to turn off our assertiveness and just be receptive to the present moment. The Queen of Cups reflects everything as it is today without needing it to change. This can be summed up by the quote from Guillaume Apollinaire when he said, quote, "Now and then, it's good to pause in our pursuit of happiness and just be happy." End quote. Two of Cups. The Two of Cups is composed of 4 building blocks. Cups as water, representing reception and reflection. 2 as Chokmah, or the zodiac, representing force and transformation. Venus, representing emotional needs and unconscious instinct. And Cancer, representing emotional support and resilience. Water, Venus, and Cancer are the element, planet, and zodiac sign most associated with the emotions. This makes the Two of Cups an incredibly reflective card of the heart, as opposed to an intellectual card of the brain. However, whereas emotions and reflections are always reactive to the environment, this card is balanced out by the second Sephirah, Chokmah, which represents the raw, active, divine energy of the cosmos behind all transformation. This makes it a kind of active reflection, which can be thought of as reflection asserted from the God pressure within instead of environmental pressures from without. This card can be summed up as actively transforming the universe through the pure reflection and unconditional support of its emotional needs. This is why the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn named this card Love. With the Chokmah aspect, I think it could be more appropriately named Choosing Love or Allowing Love. This card says to break the chain of revenge and disrespect and choose reception and reflection instead. At a practical level, this card can be about taking off your suit of armor and making yourself vulnerable, as Dr. Paul Jenkins describes in this video. How would it feel to get a hug from someone in a suit of armor? Probably not very good. We must take off our suit of armor in order to have any sort of authentic connection with others. However, when we take off our armor, we expose ourselves to danger. And when we feel we are in danger or threatened, we often tend to lash out and fight back. Dr. Jenkins summarizes this as, quote, "I guarantee you, if you choose to love someone, to be that vulnerable, you will experience some pain. When you get hurt, that's the key point where you have to choose either love or hate." End quote. He says we can choose love with 3 steps. Step 1, assume the best about the other person instead of the worst. Step 2, practice humility instead of pride. And step 3, use your creative mind to find ways to build other people up instead of hurt them and tearing them down. I highly recommend watching his entire video to learn more about this. At a mystical level, I believe the Two of Cups is about the direct experience of the love of God, or Source or Kether, which we call grace. This divine love always leads to a greater sense of wholeness and unity, and it is never accusatory or divisive. It does not tell you, "I will love you more if you do this and this and this." It instead says, "I love you, my child, exactly as you are, and there's nothing you could ever do to stop my love for you." Dr. Jenkins says that it's a parent's job to love their child, quote, no matter what and even if, end quote. The higher power also loves us, no matter what and even if, but at an infinitely cosmic and epic proportions. This card can also be about uniting with that divine influence and allowing it to flow through you until you and the source move as one. In the Book of Thoth, Aleister Crowley describes love as something which, quote, recovers unity from individuality by mutual annihilation, end quote. That's a fancy and dramatic way of saying love is something that unites two separated, divided beings into one unified being. I believe this idea of uniting with the divine influence can be summed up as fulfilling the first 3 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Steps which I believe are useful for all human beings and not just alcoholics. Step 1 is, quote, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. Step 2 is, we came to the belief that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Step 3 is, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him, end quote. In other words, I believe the 2 of Cups can represent turning our will entirely over to the higher power, allowing us to become voluntary agents of its will. It must be voluntary because, like any good parent, the higher power gave us the ability of free will. The higher power says, I want you to do this, but only if you want to do this. Once we give ourselves over to the higher power, we receive a foundational satisfaction to all of our emotional needs. We raise our baseline so that we always feel at least a little bit loved, safe, powerful, purposeful. Connection to the source makes it so that even in our darkest moments, we do not feel completely empty. So the idea here is that we have emotional needs for safety, for love and connection with others, for control. We have all these emotional needs. And if you allow the higher power to work through you and you have a connection with the higher power, you feel safer. You feel like you're in the hands of God. You feel more in control. You have the power of God behind you. You feel seen because you have a God that sees you and sees everything. So this idea of developing a connection with a higher power makes it so that your emotional needs are a bit more resilient because they are being fulfilled not just from the external environment, but they are also being fulfilled from an internal connection to a spiritual source. 3 of Cups. The 3 of Cups is composed of 4 building blocks. Cups as water, representing reception and reflection. 3 as Bina, or Saturn, representing form and restriction. Mercury, representing the logical and linguistic mind. And Cancer, representing emotional support and resilience. While the love within the 2 of Cups is infinitely expansive, I believe the 3 of Cups is where the boundaries of our love begins to take shape. While the unity of the inner dimension knows no boundaries, the multiplicity of the outer dimension of our external world requires boundaries. The 3 of Cups is where we use our intellect, Mercury, to determine what form, Saturn, this relationship ought to take. And we communicate it to the other party if necessary. Cancer is associated with the womb. And although a womb is a perfect example of an environment that unconditionally loves the child it is growing, every womb also has its limits, its boundary, an external edge to its enclosing space. In the heavenly dimension of the universe, the sky goddess Nuit's womb has no limit. But in our earthly dimension of the universe, every womb has a limit to the nourishment it can provide to its child. This idea can be summed up by Carl Jung's line in chapter 18 of the Red Book when he says, quote, "A well-tended small garden is better than an ill-tended large garden. Both gardens are equally small when faced with the immeasurable, but unequally cared for." In this card, we are asked to decide the boundary of our garden, of our womb. I once heard Lorenzo Haggerty say that if you're in a room full of people all lying on their backs, you can walk around and offer out a hand to every single person and pull them all to their feet. But if you let one of those people climb onto your back, you're going to end up on the floor with them. The Three of Cups is about not letting people climb onto your back. Establishing a boundary where it ought to be is the most loving thing you can do, because it helps keep a relationship honest and authentic. The heart is not capable of lying. Only the head is capable of lying. If your relationship requires a boundary and you refuse to set it, you are steering the relationship with your head and not your heart. By doing that, your heart will grow frustrated and resentful against both you and the other person, causing an ongoing series of stress that physically damages your body and likely leading to an emotional and sometimes even violent eruption from the unconscious. The Three of Cups is about using your head as an advocate of your heart and not as an adversary to your heart. In his video titled "Help Your Clients Be More Assertive," Mark Turrell gives 5 tips for establishing boundaries with someone else. The first tip is that before we can decide whether someone has crossed a line, we must first consciously decide where the line is. The second tip is to realize that while some forgiveness is wonderful, perpetual forgiveness of someone who keeps crossing the line can make things worse by enabling their harmful behavior and denying them the opportunity to grow into a decent human being. The third tip is to realize that not asserting ourselves is a form of lying. Thus, instead of thinking of it as asserting myself, think of it as being honest. The fourth tip is to recognize that not all people are mind readers or empaths, so we must communicate our boundary. During this communicative encounter, we can remember the ASSA acronym. That's ASSA. Stands for alert the person that you want to talk to them about their behavior, state what the problem is and why it is a behavior, sell the benefits of them behaving better in the future, and then ask them to agree to doing things differently in the future. If they ever participate in the poor behavior again, you can remind them of your agreement. The fifth tip is it's not just what you say, but how you feel when you say it. If we want someone to take us seriously, we cannot lash out in an emotional outrage because that allows the other person to dismiss us. Being overly emotional in our interaction gives them the opportunity to say, they didn't mean that. They're just having a bad day. Instead, we must communicate our boundary calmly and collected, which will add credibility to our message. One last, more spiritual association with this card is the exploration of the depths of the unconscious. In the Book of Thoth, Aleister Crowley points out that Mercury is the guide of the souls of the dead. Considering Saturn's association with death and the Grim Reaper, along with Bina's association with the Great Sea of the unconscious, we could say that this card, the Three of Cups, represents the lucid, conscious mind journeying deep into the land of the underworld, the land of the dead, the spiritual dimension to which Orpheus traveled, and of which Persephone rules in captivity. As I pointed out in Concept 2 of my M83 article, a true exploration of the unconscious requires the alchemical synthesis of both the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. In this card, we find this combination with Mercury and Saturn. Four of Cups. The Four of Cups is composed of four building blocks. Cups as water, representing reception and reflection. Four as Hesed, or Jupiter, representing organization and construction. The Moon, representing the imagination and autonomous bodily systems, or the subconscious. And Cancer, representing emotional support and resilience. All four building blocks in this card are affiliated with water. The Suit of Cups is associated with water. Cancer is a water sign. The Moon is associated with water due to its influence of the tides. And Hesed is associated with water due to its receptive nature, which grows the form established in Bina. Thus, I believe one key idea behind this card is the impermanence and ever-changing nature of our emotional self, which can be thought of as the environment housing our observing self, or higher self. From this, I associate this card with Alexei Papas's Rule of Thirds, which goes like this. When you're chasing a dream or doing anything hard, you're meant to feel good a third of the time, okay a third of the time, and crappy a third of the time. She says that if this ratio is off, chances are either you're working yourself too hard with too much challenge, or you're not challenging yourself enough. Thus, the goal of the Four of Cups is not to create an environment free from suffering, but one that both honors and respects the suffering, while recognizing challenge and discomfort as necessary ingredients to meaningful growth. Once we leave the comfort of our familiar nest, we are guaranteed to experience discomfort and suffering as we explore the world of the unknown. But only by leaving the nest do we give our true self the opportunity to soar to heights previously unimaginable. You can't soar through the sky from the safety of your nest. Beyond emotional impermanence, I believe this card can represent getting involved in an environment that helps you practice being more open and emotionally supportive of both yourself and others. Hesed is the sephira of collective organization, whether that's a collection of people forming a community or a collection of cells forming an organism. The Four of Cups does not say, do this on your own. It's not what it's about. This card says, by working with others toward a common and inclusive cause, you are retraining your default state of your subconscious to being more receptive and supportive of others. While the Two of Cups is about joining an emotional union with another individual, the Four of Cups is about joining an emotional union with an organization. This is why church communities are so powerful. At their best, they provide a robust emotional support network for the congregants. As Manly Hall said, I forget which lecture, quote, religion is a kind of mechanism by which a great deal of sadness, solitude, and frustration will find some comfort. Not a solution, but a solace. Not an answer to the problem, but a way to carry it a little easier. End quote. Emotional support networks can help us celebrate the ups and endure the downs. In his TED Talk, titled How to Start a Movement, Derek Sivers points out how we often overlook the importance of followers in movements. When describing the Dancing Man video, you'll have to see the TED Talk to know what I'm talking about. When describing the Dancing Man video, he says, quote, so here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. The first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. End quote. Sivers then points out how future followers tend to follow the other followers more than the original leader. Thus, when we pull this card, we can really reflect on this, on the importance of following, whether it's us following others or helping others follow us. Conclusion. To summarize, Cancer is all about being receptive to the emotional needs of the world, whether it's other life forms' needs or our own, and providing a foundation of nurturing, wise, supportive love. Cancer recognizes that, just as the light of a bonfire reflects across the surface of a lake, our emotional self directly reflects whether we are meeting or not meeting our needs. It also recognizes that the emotional self is an unconscious aspect of every person's nature, like a kind of autonomous biological shelter designed to protect us from malnourishment. Mama Bear. While the vice of Cancer is making our emotional self the tyrannical and irrational captain of our ship, the virtue of Cancer is treating it as a respectable and honorable crew member who can provide instinctual and intuitional guidance to the real captain, our higher self. An awakened Cancer can recognize that you can feel scared and give a presentation, feel tired and fulfill a promise to someone, feel sad and get out of bed. By modeling this emotional resilience for others, Cancer not only loves, but loves wisely. The goal of its love is not to help others feel as comfortable as possible, but provide an unshakable loving foundation upon which others can grow into authentic versions of themselves. At a mystical level, Cancer is about allowing instead of striving. Its power comes not from itself, but from the higher power flowing through itself. Because of their hard protective shells, crabs are said to be creatures that carry their homes on their backs. This is especially true of hermit crabs, which are the crabs that carry the shell around on their back to carry their home with them. When we live up to the highest virtue of Cancer, and we learn to carry the emotionally nourishing divine love with us wherever we go, then wherever we go feels a little bit more like home, both for us and for those around us. And that is my article on Cancer. I hope you liked it. If you did, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Again, if you're interested in content like this, you can sign up to my newsletter. And actually, I just started some social media accounts. I should probably start promoting that for it's currently Gemini season that I'm recording this. So in honor of Gemini season, I started some social media accounts. Seemed like a very Gemini thing to do. So you can now follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And a fun fact about that is that anytime I work on this article, or anytime I have a productive writing session, I post to social media at the end of that session. So anytime you see a post by me, it means I was working that day. So it's kind of a fun fact. Besides that, hope you enjoyed this, and may you help others and yourself feel a little bit more at home in this upcoming season of Cancer.